So originally I was going to release a full in-depth review of Pokemon Sword and Shield, but I ultimately decided that since half of the script was devoted to just the controversy surrounding Game Freak, I'd just say screw it and air my grievances more directly. I'll probably still do a review on Pokemon Sword and Shield, but that's a topic for another time. For those of you who don't know, Pokemon Sword and Shield has been kind of marred in controversy since it came out in 2019. This stemmed from a general distaste of news that over half the Pokemon from the 1000 plus catalog would be removed in favor of better, more smooth animations. That was supported by statements from Junichi and Masuda in the lead up to the game's release. After evidence emerged that the animations were in fact not all new, a wave of outrage led to a series of hashtags that really did nothing, and with it, a general fracture within the community at large. While most of the controversy has quieted in recent days, I still found myself dissatisfied and critical of Game Freak. I suspect this is due in large part to the practices of the company, which are emblematic of a general shift within the gaming industry as a whole. I'm going to out and say that Pokemon Sword and Shield is probably the most lazy entry in the mainline Pokemon series, with Game Freak adopting infuriating business practices that rival Bethesda and Bungie as of late. Now, at the time in which the DLC was announced, almost half a year ago, I was skeptical of the general consensus on its intentions. Today, I can say firmly that this game has a similar design model to that of Bungie's Destiny, and by that I mean sell an incomplete game, section off pre-rendered content for DLC later down the line, and then sell us back the cut content for additional revenue. Now, I understand that it may feel stupid to get to the point where I feel I need to make a dedicated video on the trends in game development for children's entertainment, which is what Pokemon is. Don't kid yourselves. But I'm of the opinion that that defense gets thrown around way too often to excuse truly abysmal practices in entertainment. Illumination and the trough of shitty educational games get those passes because they're made for children, and thus cannot be subject to critical thought unless you're a pathetic man-child. I've heard many people say that any speculation on the DLC's legitimacy is akin to conspiracy theories, and I would have agreed had I just glanced at the topic for a moment and not done my research. But after doing my homework with sources that, to be fair, would not have been available to them, I can safely say that the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra DLCs were content meant to fill the shoes of the lackluster post-game, and that Game Freak's plan was always to cut assets and resell them to consumers. Let's start with the timeline. Pokemon Sword and Shield's conceptual builds began in 2016, after Sun and Moon's release, and development did not begin until September 2017. The game was released on November 15th, 2019. If we do some quick math, we find that the actual committed development time of the game was roughly 2 years, or 24 months. It is worth noting that during this time, the Pokemon Company was also developing Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu, which probably put a drain on the resources to which Sword and Shield's development team could draw on. The first DLC trailer was released on January 9th, 2020, where it showed early builds of the DLC areas. This alone was not suspect enough to convince me that it was just cut content, as it seemed plausible that an early build of these areas could be shambled together in 4 months. However, it did seem strange to me that they seemed to be fairly complete despite being depopulated. But there was always this nagging suspicion. For those of you who don't know what the Destiny debacle is, Bungie was caught segmenting off pre-rendered and finished assets on the files of Destiny that would eventually be locked behind a paywall of $20 or $35 with the season pass. These completely finished assets were burnt onto the disc, sent out to consumers, and Bungie received considerable flack for the practices. However, despite being effectively vilified in many people's eyes, the fans of the game still defended it vehemently and bought the DLC, which allowed Bungie to be comfortable with carrying over that business model to the second game. If you're not familiar with how Destiny 2 has kind of fucked up everything it's ever tried, then I would suggest looking into it because its DLC policy is abysmal. However, it is still very profitable for Destiny. Why am I bringing this up? Well, because it's recently emerged that the Isle of Armor DLC was in development congruent with the full game's production. In an article published on June 17th by DeFreitas of IGN, the following is stated. I did ask if the large inclusion of old Pokemon previously unavailable in Pokemon Sword and Shield was in response to player feedback. but the Pokemon company's Elvin said that the Isle of Armor expansion was already being developed before Sword and Shield were released, so it seems as though it was always the plan, though he couldn't be certain. Of Elvin with the term Pokemon attached to it reveals him to be a spokesperson for the Pokemon company. Although I call into question the legitimacy of IGN's review scores, being a member of the Access media, I generally trust reporter for DeFreitas as she's taking care to update articles, including this one, that were not representative of the truth. However, despite this being updated recently to clear up confusion on leveling, this phrase still remains, which leads me to believe it to be legitimate. Practical confirmation of these intentions, I started to look at the game more skeptically. Assets for rendered Pokemon that become available in the Isle of Armor or Crown Tundra DLCs were found by data miners during the initial release of the game. Models for Squirtle and Bulbasaur, just to take an example, were both not only functional and within the game's files, but fully rendered and ready to be dropped into the game. They are now both acquirable behind a paywall. This means that Game Freak actively lied about the disinclusion of the Pokemon, and then sold us back cut content. Plain and simple. While not as egregious as Destiny's similar practices, this still scares me for the slippery slope it represents that Game Freak is not held accountable for these anti-consumer practices. Additionally, we can safely discount everything Game Freak says about models going forward, as Reddit sleuths quickly deduce that the wiring of the Pokemon used in Sword and Shield had very similar, if not identical, frames to that of their 3DS counterparts. This means that Masuda and Game Freak actively misled and lied about the development process because they knew the optics of these business decisions would be abysmal. This shit is fucking ridiculous. These are the exact practices which earn companies like Activision and Bungie infamy, but according to fans of Pokemon, it's all okay because it's better than a third game! If I could just quickly counter that argument, I would say that a third game would be better because it'd be able to release with a far better and more comprehensive experience than what we received. Had the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra been added to this hypothetical third game as additional content, it would have filled the game's lack of a post-game, which is what I think these DLCs were meant to be before they were cut. Additionally, they could have used the combined development time of these two DLCs, give or take 15 months, to iron out and greatly improve the initial product, which very well could have paid its price of admission. While we're on cost, the DLCs are bought for each game individually. As far as I could tell, the DLC does not allow anyone to, say, purchase the passive Sword and play it with Shield. I would be on board for that argument had that been the case. Instead, if you own both, like I do, you will need to pay $60, another full AAA price tag, to be able to access it from both games. It seems like everybody making that argument has not considered the fact that video games are an expensive ass hobby, and even a $13 price tag for DLC is something that should be vetted with the same scrutiny you give a $60 game. I, for one, will not be buying the DLC, and I want to make that clear. I probably will eventually play it through a game share with a friend, but I simply refuse to let myself be screwed by another AAA company thinking I won't notice their practices. I say this all the time, but I will say it again here. Vote with your wallet. If you pay for this content, you are effectively telling Game Freak, regardless of how you actually feel, that you are okay with these practices and you are okay with their deception. Everyone watching who hasn't made up your mind yet, let me be clear. Paying $15 for what is cut content at best, solely on the basis of accumulated goodwill, is exactly what got Bethesda to the point where they were comfortable putting Fallout 76, a game whose launch was so flawed it set a new benchmark for how low a game can go, on the market. Do not give Game Freak a free pass here just because they develop Pokemon. Once they have your money, they couldn't give half of a shit whether you're critical of it afterwards, because they've already made theirs. This is why we, as the consumers, need to make conscious decisions about where our money goes and to what. This stance against DLC that is effectively cut content is a stance I've held for a long time, and one which I will continue to hold. I would implore each of you watching to adopt a similar mentality of critical thought towards the content you consume, no matter the price tag attached, because corporations will always push and push until they can't anymore. I don't want Game Freak to have a Battlefront 2 kind of situation, because I actually love their content, but I'm not stupid enough to think they actually care about me as a person or as an individual consumer. They care about the money. They care about getting your money. They will do everything and anything they can justify and reasonably get away with to get that sweet, sweet dough. You know, now that I'm saying it out loud, a Pokemon Fallout 76 sounds like it might be one of the most fun things to talk about ever. So, yeah, stay your course, Game Freak. I want to see you fuck up the most basic shit in the future.
It just works. these NPCs are not scripted. You can walk all the way to the top of that mountain. Go where you want, do whatever you want.